So I want to address a little bit, just pretty briefly, actually pretty quickly. We're just going to go through some things to assure you, so that you know, so that you can see, so that you can at least have heard that the things related in Scripture, there's external evidence to indicate the reality of these things. That the Bible is not simply a collection of myths. What makes the Bible and its collection of myths different from the Greek gods, or the stories even of Homer, or various other myths that we read about? What makes it different? And one of the things that makes it different is the external evidence. In fact, I would argue that more than any other religion in the world, Christianity relies upon the historical, factual events. Look, the truth is, ask a Buddhist if Buddhism changes if Buddha never existed. If it turns out that Buddha is just a story and there was no Buddha, does Buddhism change? Truth is, no. Buddhism doesn't change fundamentally. The things it says are still the things it says. If you could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Muhammad was not Muhammad, that he didn't exist in the way that he said he was, Islam would still press on. If you could prove any number of religions that their historical beginnings were not what they thought they were, the religion would press on. But if you prove that Jesus Christ never existed, you have no Christianity. You have nothing left. The teachings of Christ are not the most important thing about Christianity. Do you understand that? The most important thing about Christianity is Jesus Christ himself. We pin our faith upon the fact that these things really happened. Just a very quick review. We talked last week, manuscript archaeology prophecy. We looked a lot at manuscript evidence last week, about the bibliographical data. We looked about the fact that they were eyewitnesses. They were writing actual accounts of what they'd experienced. We're going to talk today about external evidence and archaeology. Anytime you talk about the history of Scripture, and this will happen if you find yourself speaking to a skeptic or an unbeliever, anytime you talk about the history of Scripture, whether it really happened, particularly in the Old Testament, obviously one thing that's a big question is whether someone actually died and came back to life. We'll get to that. But in the Old Testament, one of the first things people will mention, one of the biggest issues when you're talking about external evidence of history or archaeology is the Exodus problem. People will bring up the Exodus problem. And I want to address it first for two reasons. One is because it's a valid question. The Exodus problem is a valid question, and the problem is basically this. Scripture tells us that about 1 million people left Egypt and traveled across the desert for 40 years. Now, you would think that would leave some impact on the world. 1 million people leaving Egypt and crossing the desert should leave some evidence. Consider Egypt alone. Their entire slave labor force left. The Pharaoh gathered his army, chased after him, and was destroyed. We should see evidence of this in Egypt, shouldn't we? There should be a decline in Egypt's power. Then you got this 1 million people who travel across the desert, and they should leave artifacts, shouldn't they? They should leave evidence. And the issue is that archaeology has not yet discovered, and let's just be honest about it, archaeology has not yet discovered the wealth of evidence you would expect to find in regards to the Exodus. We don't find the wealth of artifacts that you would expect to find. So it's a legitimate question. But the first thing I would just remind us of, even though it is legitimate that you would expect to find things, this is often used as sort of the concluding argument. People will say this proves that Scripture does not relate to history at all because there's no sign of the Exodus and that should be there. Let me just remind you of a very simple point, and that's that absence of proof is not proof of absence. The fact that we can find evidence is odd, but it does not in and of itself prove that it didn't happen. You understand that? Okay. Second thing is, what we do know is that no archaeological finding has ever invalidated anything in the biblical record, not anything. And it's not a lack of looking. There are over 25,000 digs in the Middle East going on. And in all those digs, never have we found anything that invalidates what Scripture says happened. Now, that's not the same as proving it, but you would think again that you would probably find something. And number 3, many things have proved the biblical record. In fact, there are things that they find. It's easy to sweep away all of the Old Testament by saying there's nothing about the Exodus, but that would be a grave mistake, because there's ample evidence of many other parts of the Old Testament. In fact, what it turns out is that most of the absence of evidence is prior to Solomon. There's a lot of archaeological finds prior to Solomon that we don't have. We don't find. We can't find evidence of. The most problematic questions, the things that we think we might have found but not sure, things like Sodom and Gomorrah or the walls of Jericho, these are things that are in doubt. But is that any big surprise? Wouldn't you expect the oldest, the most ancient findings would be the ones that would be hardest to pin down? Of course. For one thing, they're literally buried deeper, aren't they? For another thing, it's harder to grasp and to figure out what they should look like at such a different time. Okay, so once you get up to Solomon, the amazing thing is, once you get up to Solomon, you find a wealth of evidence that the history of Scripture is accurate. So just taking that alone, that going from Solomon on, you find a wealth of evidence that Scripture is historically accurate. But we don't find this great Exodus thing, but neither do we find a lot of things before Solomon. That together doesn't lead you to conclude, therefore, that Scripture is incorrect. It leads you to conclude that Scripture, anywhere it can be proved, has been proven accurate. And that's worth recognizing. Let me ask this, too. Let's just look at prior to Solomon just for a second. If the whole world came from one people, as the Old Testament tells us, and split only after the Tower of Babel, what would you expect to see? If you were looking for certain things, and the whole world was one people, and then split at the Tower of Babel, what would you expect to see? Yeah, you'd expect to see some migration for sure. You'd expect to see languages that all come back to a common language. Okay, both of those things we do see, by the way. You'd expect to see common ancestry. You'd expect to see very little difference genetically between the races, which we also see. But how about this? How about shared stories across cultural boundaries? How about stories that occurred before the Tower of Babel that different cultures who've had no contact with each other since the Tower of Babel all share? That would be indicative that they had contact at one time, wouldn't it? That they share a common ancestry and a common stories. Did you know that every single known culture in the world, every single one has a flood story in their background? Every single one. If it was a worldwide flood, you'd expect that, wouldn't you? They don't all have exactly the same story because stories shift and change, but the similarities are enough to tell us that they didn't just share it with one another because they didn't have contact with each other. Literally, missionaries will go into places that have had no contact with other humans, tiny, tiny tribes. And these tribes will know the story of the flood. They will know of a flood that wiped everybody out. And usually they will know of one person in his family who was saved by a boat. One of the oldest stories, in fact, the oldest story we have that we've ever found any writings of is a story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's a Babylonian story of the flood. It's a Babylonian story of the flood, written at a time that they did not have contact with the Semitics, with the Jews. You would expect to see that kind of thing. You would expect to see flood stories, things like that. Of course, every culture has a creation story, but you could certainly argue that just comes from the fact that we all know we're here. So I won't push that one.